Hi, this is Lisa Klink. I wrote for Star Trek Voyager for 3 seasons, and you're listening to Trek Untold.
Welcome to Trek Untold, the Star Trek podcast that goes beyond the stars. I'm your host, Matthew Kaplowitz. And more importantly, welcome back to part 2 of my interview with Lisa Klink. In case you missed it, Lisa was a writer on DS9 and executive story editor on Voyager, and has been credited with writing 15 episodes by herself on Star Trek series, 14 of those being from Voyager. Lisa was also a producer on shows like Roswell and Martial Law, which regular fans of this podcast know is a personal favorite of mine. And she also wrote episodes for other TV shows like Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, 1-800-Missing, Painkiller Jane, Pandora, and another Gene Roddenberry show, Earth Final Conflict, which we're going to spend some time talking about today too. As for Trek, the first part of this conversation had Lisa discussing her origins as a professional screenwriter and a handful of her Voyager episodes as well as her DS9 episode Hippocratic Oath. This time, we're going to finish talking about her time on the Voyager writing team with her role as executive story editor, and we're also going to chat about another unique piece of Star Trek history that also happened to take place in Vegas. You see, Lisa was the writer for the Borg invasion at the Star Trek Experience. It doesn't get more obscure than that, and it was pretty cool learning about that and the process to make that come to life. We also got a few more surprises on the way, so stay tuned for those. So with all that said, stick around because today it is time to get the rest of the story from Lisa Klink. But before we begin this week's episode, I want to remind you to follow Trek Untold on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Trek Untold, all one word. You can get show updates, check out some fun memes, and let me know what you think about what's going on with the current events in the Star Trek universe. You can also support this show directly on Patreon at patreon.com/TrekUntold, where you can support this show for as little as $2 a month. At higher tiers, you can listen to the shows before they come out, know about my guests well in advance, and even have a chance to ask them questions, get transcripts of these episodes to make sure you get all the info, and more benefits coming soon, including watch parties and live streams. But that's all dependent on more fans like you coming over and letting me know you want to be a part of events like that. If you want some Trek Untold merchandise, check out our store for gear and apparel, including shirts, hats, stickers, water bottles, notebooks, and a whole lot more. New designs will be added throughout the year, so it's always worth taking a peek. Trek Untold also has an Amazon shop where you can peruse everything Star Trek, sci-fi, and geeky on Amazon in one convenient location. If you're looking for a gift for the Trekkie in your life, or maybe want to see some of my favorite non-Star Trek things that you can get for yourself, check out the link for my Amazon shop in the show notes on the audio version and in the description below this video on YouTube. If you're listening to us on iTunes or any other audio platforms that allow for ratings and reviews, please leave us a 5-star rating and a positive review to help out this show. If you're watching it on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe to us at youtube.com/TrekUntold and give the video a thumbs up and a comment. All of these things help more people find this show and to continue growing and bringing you awesome guests each and every week. Now, without further ado, let's beam in this week's guest. Computer, access interview file. And welcome back to Trek Untold, and joining us once again on the other side of the screen, she's back for part 2. We've got Lisa Klink. Lisa, how's it going today?
It's going pretty well. How about you?
I'm doing good. Thank you again for coming back for part 2, because we have a whole lot more Trek to talk about here, and we got a whole lot of other things to discuss in this episode too, because, there's, besides just Star Trek, there's a lot of other really cool things on your resume here, and, one of them I think we have to talk about right now, totally on Star Trek related, but we gotta talk Jeopardy. Because not only were you on the show, you killed it. You had like a multiple time run on that show. You filled your pockets with a lot of gold press platinum. I would love to hear about your time on Jeopardy, and just, I guess, starting at the very beginning here, like, how did you actually get on the show? How does someone get cast to be on Jeopardy?
Well, at the time they had an online quiz first, and that was the first thing you had to take. And you had to get a certain score that they would tell you what it was. You had to get a certain score before you got passed on to the next step, which was the interview, which at the time was in person. Now I think they do it over Zoom. But you'd go in and basically play a sample game and kind of, banter with the host and, basically act like you were on the show. And then if you passed that, you sort of got put in a pile of potential contestants. And they told you that, they could call you anytime, in the next couple of years, to come and be on the show. So they did. They called me probably 7 or 8 months later.
Wow.
And said that, they had room for me and would I, am I available to be on the show, which I was, fortunately. Now, what a lot of people don't realize about Jeopardy is that they film 5 episodes a day, that they don't do one a day. And so, when the Monday show and the Tuesday show and, that the entire week of shows is all filmed on a single day. So I went in actually for the Monday show to start with and ended up, filming 5 episodes that day. Which was so much fun. I can't even tell you. I mean, stressful fun, sure, but like high adrenaline, kind of exciting fun. And it was a great experience. I mean, everybody there was really nice. Alex Trebek was very sweet. I'm really glad that I got to meet him.
I mean, you are a person of very high intelligence here, goes without saying. So I'm kind of curious how the question parts work, because as you mentioned, you're filming 5 episodes in this one day here, right? So how do you know, or do you know about the topics in advance, or is it all just kind of like what you know is what you know, and best of luck to you?
It's more the second thing. You don't know what the topics are going to be in advance.
Oh, that is stressful.
It could be anything. I mean, I studied a little bit, when I knew that I was going to be on. I studied American history because they always have some category with American history, the Revolutionary War, or presidents, or something. So that seemed like the most useful kind of topic to know stuff about. And also, it wasn't one of my stronger points. So I did study a little bit.
Well, I mean, mad respect to you for doing that, because that's just like, even thinking about it is anxiety inducing. So to do that, and then to sit through it for like that many episodes and survive as a champion, I mean, that's pretty stellar. And if you don't mind telling us, yeah, if you don't mind too, I don't know if you're allowed to say this number. What was your final tally at the end of your run?
I think I made something like 72,000.
Wow, nice.
Yeah. And it's funny because when the episodes aired, it was actually during the writer's strike.
Oh.
And so a friend of mine kind of joked that, at that moment, I was the highest paid writer in Hollywood because I was the only one getting any money from anywhere.
It's horrible, but true. I mean, were you actually on working for Voyager at that point, or was that a different show when you were on?
No, I think I was not on a show at that point for the Writers Guild strike.
That's a crazy number to have. Wow, congratulations. I look forward to looking up the YouTube, find more clips of that show too, if I can find. Are there clips of that episode on YouTube?
There are a couple of clips of me on Jeopardy on YouTube, yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to go hunting. I'm gonna make sure to put some links in there for folks who want to check this out. And Lisa, I want to ask you about a few other shows today too. And there's another sci-fi series that you worked on, which I believe is tied to Gene Roddenberry, and that's Earth: Final Conflict.
Yes.
And yeah, so the show was based on some of his older work, and I believe was overseen by Magel at this point, because Gene had passed away many years before this actually aired. So you were credited as executive story editor for many of the episodes, and it's a pretty interesting show. It kind of has a little bit of everything, like it's a contemporary setting, but it's very high sci-fi, and it went 5 seasons, which I remember seeing it when it first aired syndication here and there. I didn't realize it went 5 seasons, so wow. But yeah, I'd love to kind of hear just like, I mean, it's such a big thing to ask, because I know it's like we're trying to condense 5 seasons into like a little quick question here. But what an interesting show to work on. I mean, it feels like just a very unique chapter in sci-fi TV history.
Yeah, it was. I mean, for me, the great part is always, working with good people. Whether the show is good or bad, what really makes a difference day to day is the quality of your staff that you're with. Because you spend, hours and hours, in rooms with these people. And I remember that was a really nice staff. It was really, really good creative people on that show.
Did any of the folks you worked with over on Star Trek on that writing team, were they part of Earth Final Conflict as well?
No,
Okay.
it was a totally different group of people.
Okay. So, in terms of like Gene's contribution, because yeah, we mentioned he was passed at that point, and so he can't exactly oversee things, but I know his wife was there. Magel was part of the production as well. So when it came time for like stories and getting inspiration, like what exactly are you pulling from the Roddenberry archives, if you're pulling anything to kind of help tell your stories?
Well, when I was there, we weren't really going to the Roddenberry archives very much. they had kind of set the story in motion that had a lot of sort of ongoing threads. It wasn't really, episode of the week or, science mystery of the week. It really was more serialized, which I think is great, which really kind of gives you a lot more engine, for stories.
And I think it was also known for having a pretty high turnover rate with a lot of the actors on the show. I feel like it's kind of like notorious for that.
Again, they didn't film anywhere near us. I think they were in either Canada, maybe.
Usually that's like the 90s sci-fi shows had to be in Canada. That's like a rule, I think someone wrote.
I think you're right. But I didn't get to get into the set, and I didn't get to really get to know any of the actors. And again, it was one of those shows that really the concept and the story was really the star. It didn't really have like, a captain, or somebody who was like the center of the cast. And so, in telling the stories, there were just a lot of sort of call for new characters and changes, which I think kind of kept it interesting.
But that also has to be pretty stressful too, because again, like I think by the end of the 5th season, like I think the first person to, or rather the only person to keep there the entire series was like one of the bad guys.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I'm like wondering, like, how much does that screw with your plans though? I mean, as much as you're moving episode to episode and adapting, I mean, that's got to mess up with long-term plans, right?
Well, it's tough to make really long-term plans. Again, in television, you're dealing with, production starts on Monday. You got to get the script done right now.
Yeah.
And the executive producers really kind of have an eye on the long term, what they want the story arc for the whole season to be. But at the level of like executive story editor, I was really much more focused on the script that was right in front of me. And so I wasn't really consulted on the long term.
And just last thing about this, because again, I have not watched all 5 seasons, admittedly, so that's a lot of work for me to do. But I'm gonna get on it if I can find it again. But I'd love to know, like, did you have a chance to actually spend any quality time with Magil?
Not really.
Okay.
Not really while I was on that show. I mean, when I was on Voyager, I went to a couple parties at her house. She threw great Christmas parties. So I spent a little more time with her when I was on Voyager, but not when I was on Final Conflict.
I mean, what was she like to hang around? I mean, the Christmas parties sound epic, but I mean, was she like Luxana in real life, or how would you describe her?
No, I wouldn't say she wasn't quite that over the top, but she's definitely very outgoing and very friendly. I mean, you really feel like, she loves throwing parties. She loves having a house full of people, and that's really her element, I think. For writers such as myself, my element is sitting at home by myself and writing. But for Magil and for I think a lot of actors, it's really kind of being out in public. And she was definitely a larger than life kind of person.
Now, I'm patting myself on the back here because I actually waited until this episode to talk to you about this. But Lisa, I need to tell you, I love martial law. It is,
oh, thank you.
Ironically, one of my favorite shows. I loved it when it was on TV the first time. I catch it now when it's on Heroes and Icons. And I've spoken to a lot of folks who did the show, and they all have interesting stories about it. And I know that you were a writer and producer for martial law. Which is, again, another big reason I had to have you on this podcast. With a resume that was primarily sci-fi at that point, how did you get yourself involved in Sammo Hung's big American vehicle?
Well, the executive producers were friends of mine, Lee Goldberg and William Rabkin. I actually taken a class from Bill Rabkin at UCLA, a TV writing class, way back in the day. And so they called me to be on martial law. And I was lucky because, as you said, I really just had, sci-fi credits. But, they were able to kind of see past the genre of the writing to the quality of the writing. And they thought that, they liked my characters. And so they thought I'd be good for a cop show, I guess. But again, that was very character focused. I mean, it was really about Sammo Hung and Arsenio Hall. Yeah. And their kind of wacky relationship, with the fish out of water, and that show was a lot of fun to work on.
I've heard of the show before from other folks who were actors on it, that Sammo basically had to learn his lines phonetically, so his English was not known for being good or even existing. But in the case of the writers' room, in the case of like what you guys were doing, did Sammo have any say, or did they have any interest in what the plots were, or was he just kind of like, tell me what to do, I want to kick things?
Yeah, he never really consulted with us about stories that he wanted to see or developments that he wanted in the character. I mean, he came from the Hong Kong martial arts background. And so our job sort of as writers was to give them like a very basic story with a lot of setups to do action sequences. That was really kind of the function of writing on that show. And you know, some fun character stuff. Like I say, you know, fish out of water stuff. But he and the stunt team were just amazing. I mean, they would take just like, you know, 3 sentences in the script, you know, and turn it into this massive, you know, 5 minute action sequence. They were amazing.
I think that's one of the things about writing for TV and film that kind of fascinates me is like how do you write action? And I guess it sounds like in this case for martial law, it was very much like you just said, like it's very, very minimal. You just let them do their work. But I mean, is that
Yeah.
normally how it is?
No. Again, when I was on Voyager, I wrote a couple of fight sequences. Um, and really what you need to focus on isn't so much the specific moves, like, you know, who punches who in the jaw when, but like who's winning and who's getting hurt and, you know, sort of the dynamics of the fight. You know, somebody is advancing and somebody's retreating and somebody's, you know, wounded and somebody's, you know, winning. And again, character stuff about somebody, you know, locks eyes with somebody who's watching, you know, so you really kind of tell the story of the fight more than you tell the choreography of it. You know, that's what we have stunt coordinators for.
So it's all more about the emotion, I guess, if you will, within the scene. That's kind of what you're trying to convey.
Yeah, the emotion and the again the plot, you know, like who wins the fight, you know, and who's better at fighting than the other one, that sort of thing.
And it's a really fun show. If anybody hasn't watched it yet, like really do yourself a favor and find a way to get it because it's still such nostalgic fun for me to check it out. Is there an episode that you wrote that's like one of your favorites, or maybe not even one you wrote, but like do you have a favorite one that you just think about every now and then?
Actually, I think my favorite one that I wrote was Samo Claus. You know, because it started with the title,
Yeah,
you know, which is kind of an obvious title, but then it was like, all right, how are we going to get Samo in a Santa suit? And we had this elaborate plot where there was a computer chip that was missing, and it was in a toy that, like a talking toy, Armando the talking armadillo. I actually have one of those props still,
nice.
with a removable head.
I'm jealous.
But the whole point of that episode was to get Samo in a Santa suit. And we ended up getting a whole bunch of other people in Santa suits and having a big old Santa fight in the shopping mall, which which again was the whole point of the episode. And the stunt people just had the best time with it. And they had set up these big like cloth, you know, sort of bouncy cloth expanses, and so they would like, you know, almost like trampolines, and they would bounce off of this and go tackle the Santa over here, and then they would go fight over here. I mean, it was really incredible. I think that was one of our best episodes.
I mean, I feel like it's a show you just couldn't do today either. The way it's kind of structured, and especially having it structured also around Sammo Hung specifically and what he wants to accomplish with those fight scenes. But yeah, just what a great show. And you know, it is kind of sad it only lasted 2 seasons.
Yeah.
But you guys did get to have a finale, which is, you know, sometimes when you write shows, you don't get that ability to do that. Sometimes it's just the plug
Yeah.
is pulled and it's over.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'm curious in the case of martial law, like, did you guys have to rush to the finish line with this finale? Or, you know, like, was it kind of like you knew that this was the finite end to it at a certain point before, let's say you had to film, like, you know, a week or two before?
Well, again, the executive producers probably had the heads up before the rest of the staff. But again, they were really good showrunners, and so they really kept us all informed about what was going on. And so I think that we knew a couple of episodes ahead of time, so we could sort of ramp up to the finale.
So if the show had gone on for like season 3, season 4, 5, whatever, did you have any long-term plans for any of the characters, or were there any plots that you wanted to do that you didn't get a chance to?
I can't really think of stories that I wanted to do. We had dropped in a few hints about Samo's son, that he had some kind of like estrangement from his son. And I think actually in Samo Claus, he got a Christmas present that he thought was from his son. And so we've kind of teased that this relationship might happen. And so I imagine if we had gone on, you know, to season 3 and beyond, we might have introduced that his son as a character.
That would have been really cool. So yeah, I'm gonna not nerd out all day about martial law with you because we have a lot more Star Trek to cover here. So I think let's go ahead and jump on into a little bit of that right now. And before we get back into Voyager, there is something else you did in the world of Star Trek. There's a few things you did. I want to start with a video game. So you wrote the storyline for the canceled PC game Star Trek Voyager Retribution, and that was
Yes.
meant to kind of be like the Voyager follow-up to the DS9 Harbinger game. So what can you tell me about the story of this game? And I mean, what is it like to write a video game? That's kind of a different experience, isn't it?
It is, but I like trying different things. I mean, I like trying different formats. I've done a bunch of things. I've done comic books, I've done short stories and novels. I mean, I wrote the Borg 4D experience in Vegas.
Yeah, we're coming to that one next.
Okay. But what I really like is telling stories according to different rules, basically. To tell a story in video game format, you have to have sort of different possibilities, depending on what the player does. But you want to steer them in a general direction, and so they have to be free to choose from 4 or 5 different options. But those options all have to ultimately lead to, the big climactic fight, or, the big, the next level of the game. And so it needs to feel flexible while actually being very focused.
At the time, were you a video gamer at all? Did you play any games?
Not really.
Okay. Did you do any gaming? I should ask then for research.
Not really. Again, I kind of left that part of it to the experts. And I sort of just brought in my Voyager character knowledge, because I figured that's what I had that they did not.
Now, I believe in the game too, you had introduced 2 new species, which were, and you could correct me if I'm saying this wrong, because I probably am, but there was the Gudge and the Entiket, I believe they were.
That sounds right.
Sounds right. Okay. If you're the ones who made them up, so if you're saying it's good, I'll go with it. But what do you remember about them? What were those aliens supposed to be like?
I'm sorry, I don't really remember. That was such a long time ago, and it didn't go forward.
Yeah, yeah. I was actually wondering if you knew any or had any insight about the cancellation, why it didn't go forward.
I have no idea.
Mm.
I was just sort of brought in as a consultant, so they didn't really fill me in on the details.
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate it never got off the ground, because I really would have liked to see what they did with it, because that DS9 game was pretty interesting. So I imagine for Voyager, it must be kind of a similar fun experience.
Yeah.
But we will never know unless someone manages to dig up a ROM somewhere. But yeah, so Lisa, you mentioned it, so now I got to ask you: Star Trek Experience, Borg Invasion, and if anybody wants to watch it, there actually is a clip of that on YouTube. There's 18 minutes of that, which is really fun to watch. So for folks who don't know, let's just start at the beginning here. What is the Star Trek Borg Invasion?
Well, it's basically what they called it a 4D experience, because it was a 3D film with physical sort of additions. I mean, there was, the seat moved and you got wind in your face. And so it was like the California Adventure ride, California Dreaming, and like a Bug's Life. And there were a couple of rides that were like that. And like the Back to the Future ride at Universal is kind of like that. And so it was meant to be very immersive.
It definitely is. I mean, there's parts where you're being chased around by the Borg on board a ship. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's pretty unique. I recommend folks watch it, because I wish I got to experience it myself. But, essentially what you are writing is interactive theater. And
Yes.
so, for you to kind of, go back to the world of writing plays again, I mean, what is that like for you? Is there any difference to what you do with TV versus this particular unique experience?
Well, it was a little different. I mean, fortunately, I got to write for the Doctor. He was in sort of
Yep.
the pre-show, and that's always fun. I loved writing for the Doctor. He had such a great voice, so that was fun. And then getting to write the Borg was just a blast. And trying to imagine what it was like inside the Borg ship and what different kinds of drones there would be. And I remember coming up with avian drones, that would be based on a species that could fly, that was simulated by the Borg, and now the Borg can fly. And getting to write for the Borg Queen was great fun, and what we had to keep in mind was what physically would be happening to the audience at the same time.
Yeah.
There's this great moment where the Borg Queen basically shoots tentacles out of her fingertips, and then in the back of the seat, something would poke the audience in the back. And so if you watch the audience, watching this, they all go, "Ah!" at the same time. and it's because they're getting poked in the back. And so setting up, kind of keeping track of what their physical experience was like and setting that up was part of the fun.
I can actually vividly remember still doing that Bug's Life 4D thing at Disney, and the part where the bugs start moving around under your feet and on your butt.
Yep.
That
Yep.
haunts me to this day.
Yep.
So
Well, imagine that, but you're being assimilated by the Borg.
I feel like that's probably a little bit better than the bugs crawling over me. So I'll take that. But since you mentioned there is this 4D experience that goes with it, are you as the writer dictating any of that, or are they saying, "Hey, here's some different tools we have that you can play with. Find a way to use them"?
it was that they said, here are the effects that we can do. We'd like to use this and that. We'd like to use, again, poking and something in the back of the chair. And that just seemed like it really went, naturally with, the queen shooting out her fingertips at the audience. So it was very interactive. They would tell me what they could do, and I'd ask them, well, can you do this also? And, yes or no. So that was a lot of fun.
And what's kind of cool too is that you're basically writing with us in mind, like folks who go to this ride, like we are a character in the world, and things are interacting with us and around us. So again, thinking of that as a way to write too, how do you approach that? Because now there's like this other character who you don't even know how they're going to react necessarily to things, and you have to kind of lead them around, hold their hand a little bit into this world. So how do you write something like that?
Well, fortunately, I mean, the audience was basically seated and they were still. And so the interaction was more like us sort of doing things to them rather than them choosing, like, do I go in this room or do I go in that room? Or even with like the video game, do I follow this path or do I follow this path? I mean, the audience was basically in our hands. And so we could torture them however we liked.
You take such joy in saying that too. That's the frightening part.
I remember actually having discussions about how badly can we scare the audience before we end up giving somebody a heart attack. And again, when are we going to actually, scare somebody too much? So we were aware of that.
I mean, I'm legit scared of that thing, like watching it. I think if I was a little kid and I went to that, I'd be like crying my pants off and just like demanding to be let out. That's pretty scary. Like there's literally, Starfleet people get pulled up in that live action part, if you will. Yeah, it's intense. So,
yeah.
On that note too, was there anything left on the cutting room floor that you had designed or written for to be part of this experience that didn't get used or you had to adjust?
Not that I can think of. I mean, again, there was a lot of pre-planning. I mean, that was really necessary. They couldn't really afford to do visual effects and do things that would then get cut. So it was really, we had to nail down the outline.
Now, was it always going to be the Borg, or was there possibilities of it being like Klingons, or maybe a bunch of other aliens, or a completely different concept altogether?
No, by the time it came to me, it was definitely the Borg.
Okay. Now, did you have a chance to actually go and experience that yourself in person?
Oh, yes.
Yeah? How did you like it?
Yes, I went on the experience. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I never got a chance to attend, as I mentioned, so I never got to visit Quarks or anything like that. But I am really into hearing stories about this place, and so yeah, if you wouldn't mind actually just telling us, going to Vegas, what was that whole Star Trek experience like in Vegas? That just looked like such a blast.
It was. I mean, it was really kind of surreal. Because it was a universe that I was involved in. They had this basically, when you were waiting in line for the rides, they had basically this museum, where they had, all these props and stuff like that from the series and photos, and a couple of the props were from episodes that I had written. And so it was really just surreal to kind of, walk through this museum and see, oh yeah, I remember that. And oh yeah, how about that one? To go on the main, Star Trek experience, which was great fun. On the shuttlecraft and, crashing into Vegas, and then also doing the Borg 4D and then going to Quarks afterwards. It was really immersive, and it really was even better than standing on the sets because it was 360. There was nothing that like broke the illusion, that you were actually in Quarks. You couldn't turn and see the camera guy over there or, the boom guy holding the microphone. Everything was Quarks. It was great fun.
I love the names for those things. Like I'm gonna one day buy myself one of the menus off eBay if I can. It looks like so cool. Such a cool place to go to. But I feel like this is one of those things today that like I wish was still around. Sadly, it's not. Do you think this is the kind of place they could revive in like 2020s and make it successful?
I don't know. I think there's so much Star Trek out there right now in different formats that I think it would be tough to figure out which universe. Is it going to be Strange New Worlds? Is it going to be Prodigy? Is it going to be Lower Decks? I think you have to choose your Star Trek basically, in what to feature, and I think that might be kind of tricky.
All right, so Lisa, let's go back to some Voyager episodes now. We got a bunch more to talk about. I just binged a whole bunch of them to refresh my memory also. And we're going to start with Favorite Son. That's where we left off last time. Favorite Son, which is a Harry Kim-centric episode. And by the way, one of the episodes that we actually did way in the past on this podcast, we interviewed Deborah May, who was one of the guest stars in that one. So
Oh, great.
anybody listening, go ahead, check that one out. So I believe this episode has a pretty deep story attached to it, because from what I read, like, the initial script was a completely different concept, where Harry was going to actually be another alien species. So talk to me about what happened here and what the plans would have been moving forward.
Well, we never actually got as far as the script with that idea, but I mean, the initial pitch was that Harry discovers that he is in fact a Delta Quadrant alien and discovers his family, on this planet, and then has to decide, is he going to stay with them, or is he going to go, with Voyager to go back to Earth, which he had always considered his home. That was the original concept, which I liked. I mean, I thought that was a really good choice for Harry, and I thought that character had not really gotten enough focus. And so I was looking forward to doing that version of it. But then the notes came down from the studio that they didn't want, Harry hanging out with grandma, that they wanted hot babes. So, throw more hot babes in there. So we did. We made it basically the planet of women, and had them all trying to seduce him. And for evil, nefarious purposes, of course. But that was sort of the dictate from the studio, was to make that change.
Because of course any woman that takes interest in Harry must be trying to kill him or something. That seems to just be the way it is.
Yeah, it's funny because on the one hand, I know that Garrett Wang has talked about how he likes that episode.
Yeah.
Because his character is, an Asian American who is the object of desire, and you don't really see that an awful lot on television.
Yeah.
And so just the visual of, like, all these women pawing him, is kind of a positive image, which I get, and I'm glad that that's a positive image. But then, that it turns out to be that no, they're actually not interested in him. They just basically want to kill him, and then suck out all his DNA. I think kind of defeats the purpose.
I mean, of all the episodes that you did, this is definitely the most Harry episode, and there's frankly not a lot of Harry Kim episodes. So, I'd love to kind of hear what you wish you could have done with the character, maybe.
Again, it would have been nice to give him something a little more distinctive. I mean,
besides
that
the
was sort
clarinet?
of the idea behind making him an actual alien.
Yeah.
Because he was the everyman. He was basically the point of view character for the audience, because this was his first mission. And so it was like, if the audience was in Starfleet, this is kind of how they would experience things. And that's fun, but it only takes you so far. The characters that we could really write story that basically suggested stories were like, a Klingon or a Vulcan or a holographic doctor, or the captain or a former Borg. That their identities made them interesting. And I think with Harry, we never quite hooked into what made him distinct and what made him interesting, beyond, again, being sort of the audience surrogate.
Yeah, I always felt like the character of Harry Kim was just literally defined by the fact that he is an ensign and forever an ensign. That was basically it. Like, I think to me the only other Harry Kim episode that really stands out, besides The Fun of Fairhaven, is that one where it's like a time leap forward where Harry is like in the future, which
Yes.
different episode. But yeah, no, it has kind of bugged me that he had a lot of potential and it was just never really fleshed out.
Yeah, we never really found his character hook.
Now, I believe Jerry Taylor was actually quoted about this episode saying it was one of the weaker ones of this season. So, if you had your way, what would you have done to improve it now, looking back on it, this many years later?
Well, again, I would have stuck with the original story, and made it more of an emotional episode for Harry, in which he genuinely had to choose between his biological family here in the Delta Quadrant or his chosen family on Voyager. And I think that would have been interesting, and again, could have given us some insight into that character, more than just, let's throw some women at him.
Which, again, Garrett didn't mind, but who wouldn't?
Which I'm sure Garrett did not mind.
Trek Untold will return momentarily.
Trek Untold is sponsored by Triple Fiction Productions. Celebrating 15 years in business in 2023, TFP creates 3D printed Star Trek and sci-fi inspired items that fit into any collection. Whether you're a cosplayer who wants a Starfleet phaser, a Bajoran tricorder, or a Klingon dagger, Or a toy collector looking for that special accessory or diorama to make your figures truly stand out? Triple Fiction Productions has exactly what you need. And for you figure fanatics, that includes products that are the perfect size for Galoob, Mego, Playmates, and everything in between. All products are 3D printed in the US, with new designs constantly being updated on their website. Repeat customers can sign up for TFP's loyalty program for free, which is a great way to save money as you build your collection. Repeat customers can sign up for TFP's loyalty program for free, which is a great way to save money as you build your collection. Repeat customers can sign up for TFP's loyalty program for free, where the more you order, the more discounts you receive. TFP also has a pay what you want section, where clearance or misprinted items are available at a discounted price. Best of all, every product can be shipped worldwide. As a special bonus for listeners of this show, Trek Untold has a special discount code just for you. Enter Untold10 at checkout for 10% off of all orders with no minimum purchase required. That's 10% off using Untold10. To see all of their products, head to triple-fictionproductions.net. Or to stay up to date on their newest products, find them on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Triple Fiction Productions, where something is only impossible until it happens.
Have you ever watched a YouTube video and said you wish you could do what they were doing? Whether it's the filming, the production, the editing. Maybe you listen to your favorite podcast and you wondered how they put that show together, how they got that great sound quality, what gear they use, how much does it cost to get started? Or maybe you checked out a video or read a book about one of your favorite entrepreneurs and it made you say, I want to live that life. I want to do what they do. Then check out my podcast, Toys and Tech of the Trade. I'm Rich Butler, and I've been making podcasts for almost 2 decades, speaking with experts across all fields to get to the bottom of the hows and whys of their achievements. Each week, I sit down with these amazing people who have carved their own path in life and share the gadgets, the gear, and the tech that they rely on to create their content, the methods that they use to run their business, and the habits and trends that are part of their daily routine and their way of life. And all of that, of course, gets put together to make them successful. We pull back the curtain on the process to help you understand what these people do differently so that you can draw inspiration and get ideas and be inspired so that you can take action today. This podcast is inspiring, educational, it's enlightening, and most of all, it's a lot of fun. I want you to join me on this journey so that you can use the tools and advice shared in this podcast to level up your business or creative endeavors, giving you all the tips, tactics, and tools so that you can transform what you're doing from a side hustle into a full-time lifestyle where you can collect a paycheck for doing what you love. Check out Toys and Tech of the Trade wherever you listen to podcasts and check out the RageWorks Network at RageWorksNetwork.com for more info on this podcast and all of the many other great shows that we have on the RageWorks Podcast Network. That's Toys and Tech of the Trade with some assembly required.
So let's jump ahead now over to Displaced. So what was the prompt for this one? This is a pretty unique episode also, but it has some kind of roots, I feel like, in original Trek too.
Yeah, this one kind of came from the sci-fi premise of, what if basically we were, our crew was disappearing one by one and being replaced by aliens one by one, and it was kind of inexplicable that this was happening.
Yeah.
And that's where it started from. And
which is a really cool hook, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Part of the idea was that this had to be a bottle show, which meant that it had to be totally on our standing sets and couldn't have a lot of, Displaced. We had one guest set basically that already existed, but it basically had to be inexpensive, and so it had to sort of rest on this high concept instead. And we went through, at what point do we, when we're getting replaced, at what point do we start to suspect that something's wrong? Do we cooperate with these aliens? What if they say they have no idea what's going on? And it sort of became like a paranoia almost, like an invasion of the body snatchers kind of feeling that, are we being kidnapped or not? And then of course it ends up that we are, and that our ship is being stolen out from under us.
I feel like it's a very ambitious episode too, because you're doing a lot of things in this episode here. Like you mentioned, we have this invasion angle here. We have people being snatched away. We have what happens once they get on the planet. Meanwhile, then we have, I guess I'll lead into my next question here. We have now Chakotay, who becomes John McClane, and his portion of the episode kind of turns into like a little bit of Starship Mind, a little bit of Die Hard.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
is that your intention?
Yeah, it was. I mean, Chakotay is another one of those characters that we didn't serve as well as we could have, I think. And so it was fun to kind of let him be the action guy, for an episode.
I mean, I enjoyed watching him run around like that. It was like, and it felt like he was such almost like, not a different episode. It didn't feel disjointed. It was just like, wow, here he is. He's finally getting a chance to like kick some butt again, which is a lot of fun to watch him do.
Yeah, it was.
So I read that this episode kind of started out a little bit differently from the way you were approaching other episodes. And that, we talked to you last episode about how a lot of these were character studies. This time around, this was more of an ensemble episode. So talk to us about that and what was going to be different here in terms of what you had to do to make this episode come together.
Well, it sort of depends on what generates the story in the first place. Some stories come from, like Innocence, with Tuvok and the children. That was, the inspiration for that came from Tuvok's character. We wanted to explore what he was like as a father. And so that was the genesis of that episode. With Displaced, the genesis of the episode was the concept. And so we kind of approached it, from a plot point of view. And the characters were really defined by their function in the plot. More than what do we learn about this character and what deep inner, struggles do they go through? We didn't really have that so much in this episode.
I feel like this answer kind of is a great gateway here for me to kind of ask you a big picture question about writing. And so this is going to be the Lisa Klink masterclass right now here. So, let's talk about structure a little bit here and how you actually do what you do. So, this episode, I feel like it's a very ambitious one because there's a lot going on here, a lot of different moving pieces that you put together really beautifully. So how does that look for you on paper? Like when you're starting here, I guess I kind of want to ask you, what is the beginning of your thought process once you come to the table with your idea locked in? How do you begin to essentially sketch things out? And then how does it look when you're putting them on paper? What is that process like?
Well, again, in television, it's collaborative. I would pitch, the idea of, we're being replaced and we're getting captured and all that sort of thing. And, I would take, basically like a 3 or 4 sentence concept, and then we would take that to the writer's room. And then everybody would sort of throw in their ideas as well. And then, what happens in the teaser? What happens in scene 1 of Act 1? And so figuring out the details of how it works, again, is very collaborative. What does Chakotay do to fight against the aliens? And when we're on the planet, what do we discover? And what takes us to the next phase, and how do we ultimately escape? And that process is just a lot of fun. I recently wrote something that was not collaborative, that was just me. And I kind of copied the idea of a story room, and then I had like Post-it notes up on the wall, and I would like sort of change them around because it was a plot-heavy murder mystery. And so I would also have like, Post-its for the clues, and figure, okay, this clue leads us to this guy, and then this clue leads us to that suspect and clears this other guy. And it felt very similar to the way it did in the story room, where we'd have somebody at the whiteboard writing down, all of these, plot beats that were necessary to kind of build to the climax.
Now, generally speaking, do you guys essentially start with the premise and the ending and then work your way kind of backwards? Or how does that actually work when you want to structure this thing?
We don't usually start with the ending.
Okay.
Again, we start with kind of what is the through line? Is it a mystery that needs to be solved? Is it like a science mystery? Is it, a battle that needs to be won? Or is it like a character revelation that needs to come out, or a decision that needs to be made? You kind of figure out what is the engine for the story. And Michael Piller would always ask us, what is the story about? Not just what happens, but what is the heart of it? Is it about a person? Is it about an idea? Is it about, a journey? And so once you kind of have that in mind, it leads you through how does each beat of the story serve that main function? Again, if it's a mystery, what clues do we need to plant all the way through? If it's a character piece, Tuvok has to learn how to deal with these kids and ultimately has to bond with them, what beats happen along the way to make that happen? And the endings, sometimes we know it and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we kind of find it once we get there.
I feel like endings are one of the trickiest parts of anything, because it's like, you might have had this great idea, and especially when you're doing character studies, it's like you're probably so focused on the character, getting a really great ending can be a challenge or a struggle sometimes, just to find something that kind of fits or ties everything up nicely with a bow.
Yeah, and especially because we did standalone episodes, but for the most part.
Yeah.
And so everything did need to get tied up with a bow at the end. We didn't want to have some unfinished business to carry over to the next episode. And so we really had to resolve everything at the end of every episode.
But Voyager was kind of nice in that it got to be the best of both worlds in a lot of ways. Like DS9 was very much all about all 7 seasons. TNG was about every single episode one at a time. Voyager got to have a little bit of both of those things here. So, I guess it's looking at Voyager as a whole, since, you guys were a team, worked together in so many episodes. For you guys, how do you get to balance having something that carries over to the next episode and the next season and again, versus here's what's happening right now?
We really wanted to focus more on what's happening right now.
Okay.
On what is the story that has a beginning, middle, and end that all happens right now. And then we knew that we have, some overarching plot of we were trying to get home. And so maybe 2 or 3 times a season, we would have a story that it would address that big arc. Maybe we're going to find a wormhole, or we're going to find some new technology that could possibly get us closer to home. We didn't do very many character arcs. I mean, the only one that I can really think of is Tom and B'Elanna's relationship. That did carry over from one episode to the next and had a longer arc that we had to sort of consider how to address. Once we kind of got them together during the episodes, we had to figure, even if it was about something totally different, like in Displaced, that was obviously had nothing to do with their relationship, but when those characters were together, it would obviously affect how they reacted with each other. And so it really affected the execution of the scene more than it did affect the plot.
All right, so let's jump into another episode right now. Let's talk about Revulsion. This one is such a creepy one. Whenever I see it on TV, I usually turn to the channel. I get the courage to go back to watch it, but wow. So this is like literally a horror film in Star Trek.
Yeah.
I heard that the director, Kenneth Miller, he did like a lot of homages in this episode to a lot of other horror films, a lot of Hitchcock stuff. When you were writing this one, did you have any homages in the back of your head for it?
Well, Hitchcock was obviously in my head. Psycho was, an obvious inspiration because it was the character that seemed very nice and harmless on the surface. But once you kind of got past that, you get to the psychotic underneath. So there was a lot of that. And yeah, it was essentially a horror movie, on in space. But for me, the heart of it again was the Doctor, because he met another hologram, which he never did. He never got to meet sort of others of his kind. And so the inspiration for the episode was what would happen if he did meet this other hologram, and would he be inspired by him? Would he bond with him? What would that relationship be like? Would he try to save him? Would he be saved by him? And so when we kind of structured it so that this other hologram was asking for help, and the Doctor would be extra motivated to go and help him because it was a fellow hologram. So that for me was really what the story was about.
Yeah, I feel like the Doctor has such bad luck when it comes to holograms. I mean, between this episode, the one Real Life with his Hollow family, even one episode we're going to talk about a little bit later on, it seems like he was never destined to have like good hologram buddies for the most part.
No, not really.
Yeah.
He definitely did better with flesh and blood friends.
Surprisingly enough, yeah, right? So what's kind of fun also about this episode too, besides the horror stuff, which again is really great stuff, this is also the first episode I believe that you're getting to write for Seven, right? I think chronologically this is the first time.
Yeah, that could be.
And I think this one's known for very notably for the fact that Seven has her very awkward line of propositioning Harry Kim for sex.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about 7 and 9 here. So this is, I'm pretty sure your very first time writing her, because I just watched them all, so I'm pretty sure this is. What did you think of 7 when you got her in your hands to start playing with? And why did you decide to make this more of a humorous scene? And why was there humor added to her character at this point?
Well, I think we needed some humor to balance out the heavy, again, more horror aspects of the main plot. Yeah. But with 7, it was such a great opportunity because she wasn't Starfleet and she wasn't entirely human, and so she was the one that could say the things that were rude or inappropriate. and, could be obnoxious and could be confrontational. And that was a real breath of fresh air because most of the time, we had our Starfleet people were all very evolved and we're all very civilized and cooperated with each other and worked together to find solutions. And so to throw in kind of a rogue element like Seven was great because she could clash with people, very much with Janeway. I played with that a lot, and that was a really satisfying relationship. But then again, we could also see her and Harry, her kind of trying to grasp the subtleties of human relationships and just completely missing it, which was just fun.
I mean, this is Seven's first season also, so there is a lot of character building going on here. So, I'm curious if you guys had any ideas of what you were going to do with her past this season. I mean, obviously she's there, she's part of the cast, but in terms of developing her character, I mean, what were you guys thinking at this point?
Well, I know that the general idea was that she was going to reclaim her humanity, and that she would try to transition from being, totally Borg to ultimately becoming, a human being again, and embracing that. And so that was sort of the overall arc. And again, we kind of had an idea that we were going to run for 7 seasons, just because, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine had, and so that was kind of the plan with 7. As far as I understood, was that in seasons 4, 5, 6, and 7, we were going to complete that arc. But like with any other characters, you kind of see what works as you try it. When we tried her relationship with Janeway, those sparks really worked very well, and so we wrote toward that more. We included more of that relationship, and so what you see what's working. And which actors really have chemistry with each other, and then you play to that.
Yeah, I mean, I know her chemistry with the Doctor was pretty amazing here, but I'd love to get your hot take on this one here. I know you weren't writing over with the team, I think, at this point, but Chakotay, 7 of 9, and their relationship, what did you think about that?
I thought it was a little forced, quite honestly. I did not quite buy it. It seemed like they were paired up sort of at random.
I would not disagree with you, Lisa. Well, let's jump over to another one right now. Let's talk about scientific method. And we did mention some character development earlier in this episode here. And we were talking about Tom and B'Elanna. So, at this stage here, did you guys have an end goal in mind with these characters? Because I believe at this point, we've already had Dave on her, so these two have smooched. They know that they have affection for each other. So you mentioned already, you have extra seasons to play with, but did you know that, did you guys have a plan in mind for them at this point? Or was it just kind of like, let's see how this chemistry continues to go?
It was, let's see how it goes. I think that, yeah, let's see in each episode, do we advance the story at all? Their story, do we break them up? Do we get them back together? I think that just the chemistry between them worked really well. And so we wanted to keep that relationship going forward. We didn't want to break them up and have them be, hostile to each other.
I read also, this is another one of those episodes that Jerry Taylor had said was kind of a weird one. Maybe she wasn't quite so sure about this one. Do you feel that you guys accomplished what you wanted to do with the story of this one? Because it is, again, it's kind of a horror story, but it's not nearly in the same kind of horror level as Revulsion was.
Right. Well, again, this was like a concept, a sci-fi concept show, and it was also a bottle show. In that we never left the ship, we didn't have any guest stars. It basically was inexpensive, and so if you could come up with a good high concept for a bottle show, that was golden because we always needed those. And so the idea that we were being experimented upon, it kind of came from, the sort of the legends of people who have been abducted by aliens, from Earth and been experimented on and then returned. We thought about, well, what if it was our crew that was being experimented on, and they really were, by these invisible aliens who were all around them. And, what would they do to us and why? And the scene that I really like is the one where the alien is in the brig and talking to Janeway about, the scientific data that we're collecting here is going to save lives. You guys are really, I know it seems cruel, but, it was kind of the same argument for animal testing, that it may seem cruel, but, ultimately we're getting these life-saving medications out of it. And so what is the morality of that?
And was that kind of the core of the subtext that you wanted to talk about in this episode?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's a really neat one though too, because the idea of that invisible threat, especially, that's just such a creepy thing to think about.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of my other favorite scenes is when Seven is in the elevator, and she can, at this point she can see them, and she sees one of them that's like, coming at her eye with a needle, and she has to stand there and not flinch and not realize, not give away that she knows that he's there. And I thought that sort of again encapsulated the threat really well.
Yeah, I hate that scene, by the way.
I
I
thought Jerry Ryan did it really well.
Oh yeah, no, she was great. I mean, and this kind of leads me to another kind of overall Voyager question here. So I feel like as the seasons went on, especially 7 and 9 very much started to dominate a lot of the shows, and very much she was like the hero of a lot of them. I know people complain about Wesley Crusher and TNG as like the Mary Sue and that kind of thing, but once 7 kind of showed up, like the world kind of started to revolve around her a lot, and she became the person that kind of solved so many problems.
Yeah.
So what was your take on that? I mean, is that something you guys were aware of or noticed? Did it just kind of happen organically with the team?
It kind of happened organically. Again, we had this character who had all this Borg knowledge, and it was really hard not to make use of that. Because the crew naturally they would. We would ask her, and we would make use of her abilities. And I thought that the character was successful enough that we wanted to give her stories. Again, that she just had a different attitude, and she was abrasive and sarcastic, and that made her a more interesting character than somebody who was just polite. And so I think we tended to kind of funnel more stories her way, and also the actress did such a good job with it, that it just kind of ended up going that way.
So let's talk about another really, really great episode here. This is another favorite of mine, Message in a Bottle. This is most notably known as the Andy Dick episode.
Yep.
So I'm just wondering, by the way, just right off the bat here, this role was pretty much perfect for Andy Dick. Was he known to be a part of it before you guys wrote it? Was he the person intended to be this, or was that even a thought in anybody's heads at the point of when you guys were writing?
When I wrote the first draft, we did not know who was going to be in it.
Okay.
And it was a little bit of a struggle trying to figure out what kind of other hologram character would clash with the Doctor in the most interesting way. And then once we realized that we had cast Andy Dick, we rewrote the script to capitalize on him, and his abilities, and really what would make him distinct, which was to be even more neurotic than the Doctor, which I thought was great fun.
Yeah, it's like he found the two most smug holograms in the universe and put them together in one room.
Yeah, pretty much. He just out-doctored the Doctor.
Now, did you have any inspiration for how these two are going to be interacting? I mean, was this meant to be kind of a Laurel and Hardy relationship, or was there any other comedy duos you were thinking of, or anyone else completely out of left field that you were considering to use as inspirations for how these two are going to work together?
I didn't have a specific inspiration for it, except again, just what would set off the Doctor the most. What would annoy him, or what would provoke him the most. That was really the inspiration for the EMH Mark II.
I mean, if anybody's going to provoke anyone, that's Andy Dick. So yeah, yep. Mission accomplished there. Yeah.
Yeah, that was some good casting. I was not part of that. I mean, it was over my head, but I thought that was really well done.
Now, I read that Robert Picardo got involved in a little bit of the writing here and there, and that he got to write some of his lines maybe for certain things. Do you remember any of that?
I never dealt with him directly about rewriting his part. I'm sure that he came to the other writers and producers. A lot of the actors did. We had a very strict policy that they could not ad-lib on the set. That any kind of changes in dialogue had to be run by the writer and producer first. And so some of the actors took advantage of that, and I mean, in a good way, in that, I mean, they would contact us and say, I had this idea, and how about if we do this instead? But really the ultimate decision was always the writer and the exec producer.
I'm also curious, we've been talking about a lot of different Star Trek things, and everybody knows the term technobabble. If you don't know what that is, that's all the crazy jargon they use for talking about reversing the polarity and all that kind of stuff. So is there a Bible or a guide that you guys have on staff to write this technobabble? How do you guys make sure you're not confusing your protons with your photons?
Well, we do have a science advisor. Okay. At the time, it was Andre Bomanis, who was an actual astrophysicist. And so he would always read through our scripts to make sure that we weren't saying something that was physically impossible, or scientifically just implausible. And sometimes we would come to him from the beginning and say, we need this kind of stellar phenomenon. What would be close? What would be plausible enough? And so that was kind of the standard that we had. It just needs to be plausible enough, that it's not going to take the audience out of it and go, oh, come on. Anything that would stop short of that would be believable, we could run with.
I mean, I'm not one of those folks that like understands any of that techno babble, but I know there's a lot of folks out there who do very, very passionately. But it is kind of an interesting note to just think about the fact that like so many of these episodes and a lot of their conclusions, the scientific conclusions, are very much dictated by someone who's not a TV writer, but an actual scientist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's just like kind of mind blowing for me right there to figure out. So this episode also introduces the Herosian for the first time, or at least it kind of teases them a little bit here.
Right.
So, did you guys have any, well, I guess I should bat this up here. I was going to ask if you guys had any plans. That's what I've been asking all along here. But the inception of the Herosian, what were these guys meant to be? Where did the idea come from? And yeah, what were the plans going to be for them?
Well, the idea was that they were hunters. And, anytime we were conceiving of an alien race, I mean, the trick is always what motivates them. Are they after money, like the Ferengi, are they after resources? Are they after knowledge? Are they after body parts like the Vidians were? And in this case, they were hunters, kind of like Predator, the Schwarzenegger movie. And that's, I think, sort of what we had in mind, is that when we encountered them, they wouldn't be at all interested in diplomacy because they wouldn't see us as equals. They would see us as prey. And that was a situation that we hadn't really been in with, been involved with another alien race like that before. So that seemed like kind of an interesting take on it.
Yeah, it was like my first thought when I first saw him. I feel like it's a lot of our initial thoughts when we see the Herosian. It's like, hey, it's the Predator. He just showed up finally. So, but on that topic of threatening aliens, this is my nerdy little moment on the soapbox here. But, I always felt like over time that Voyager really kind of weakened the Borg. And, case in point, we're bringing in the Herosian, who are like this giant threat. We have species 847. The species.
Yeah.
And basically, like, the Borg were used to make other aliens look more threatening, which in turn kind of weakened them. And, like, there's stories like Drone and Survival Instinct that very also humanize these species, humanize the Borg, which, again, as hard as it is to say, it does kind of weaken them as a galaxy-level threat.
Yeah.
So, was there always kind of like the intent to use the Borg in this way? And like, was the goal to kind of maybe actually make them good guys?
Not good guys. But I think that, our instinct is always to make races and characters three-dimensional. Nothing is all just sheer evil. You got to think there's got to be more to them than that. Just to because in reality, there's always more to somebody than that. And so that just makes it more interesting. And so kind of trying to find the weak spots and the chinks in the armor, especially with somebody like the Borg, because we had 7 of 9, because she connected us with them in a way that really kind of inspired more stories about them to come to Voyager. And I agree with you that, sort of the better we got to know them, the less of an epic threat they were. And that was kind of unfortunate because, they were at one point, the biggest bad that we had ever run into. But again, I think just the more you learn about them, the more we're going to find their weaknesses, and that's just inevitable.
These days we now have over in Picard the kinder, gentler Borg Queen played by Alison Pill.
Yes.
But, back in the Voyager times, was there any discussion or any ideas tossed around to be like, hey, 7th season, Voyager makes it back, and also now the Borg are our allies. They're part of the Federation.
I don't think there was ever any talk about them becoming allies or good guys in any way. They were always going to be, because again, their motive was to assimilate. And that's something that the Federation was never going to be okay with.
So Lisa, let's move on to Retrospect, which is an episode you share the credit with Brian Fuller. So, this is one I got a lot of questions about. So I read that the original writing prompt was meant to be a little bit different also, not too far-fetched, but, pretty different in terms of what the initial concept was. Do you remember what the initial idea was for this episode?
I do. It was essentially the phenomenon of recovered memory. Because at the time, that was about the time we were dealing with the McMartin school case, in which these children had basically been induced to remember all these horrible things like torture and satanic rituals and all that kind of thing, none of which was true. And I remember there was also a psychologist named Elizabeth Loftus who had come out with studies about how easy it was to get people to remember things that had never happened. To talk to college students about, an incident in their childhood when they got lost in the mall, and did they remember that? And all of the students came around to, oh yeah, I do remember that. And in fact, it never happened. So that memory phenomenon was what inspired Retrospect. Was we tried to figure out what would happen with one of our characters if they were induced to remember something that had not happened. And that's what the focus was meant to be.
Like, I'd read on a Memory Alpha that like an earlier draft was in fact that there were aliens that did do some operations on Seven, and so like would that have been like kind of the same concept, or what was it at that point, if you remember that?
I don't remember going through that phase in which the memories were actually true. I think they were always meant to be false memories.
Okay. So, I think the episode itself, too, the subject matter is one we could heavily scrutinize today. And I mean, I'd like to do that right now with you, because...
It has not aged especially well.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
Retrospect, no pun intended. It shouldn't have been as sexual as it was. It was obviously an allegory for rape. The fact that it turns out not to have happened, and that we should not have believed Seven when she said that she was assaulted, that has not aged very well, and I regret that it is viewed differently now than our intention was.
Yeah, I think that, and even some of the little nuances in this episode here, like like Seven just becoming very hysterical over what's happening in the situation too, and not being believed, and the doctor kind of like hyping her up over it more and more. It's definitely a little bit rough to watch by today's standards. Definitely would not fly. And I think even for them, the topic could definitely been handled in a more sensitive way. So. Looking back on things in retrospect, another pun there, if you could do things differently today, if you could rewrite this episode today, what would you do to make it different?
I think I would not have it be a woman. I think I would have it be a different character, and have maybe the memory itself be something different. Again, something that did not feel like a sexual assault. And because again, the intent was that the doctor in particular was kind of making more of the memory than was really there, because he basically noticed, Seven having this weird reaction to a medical device, and kind of started picking at it and saying, well, this must be something more, and there must be something more that you're remembering, and there's trauma, and so he was kind of like the child psychologists were with the Mark Martin case, kind of taking a small potential symptom and blowing it up into, therefore, this must be this heavy trauma that you are repressing. So yeah, I think I would have made it not a female character and have it not feel like, not be an assault, and have it more focus on the recovered memory.
Yeah, I mean, like when I did some research about the episode and I found out that was kind of like the goal of the episode was more about recovered memory, I was like, I don't know if I saw that. Like to me, what I saw was essentially assault and the analogy of rape and being violated.
Yeah.
So I mean, was there intention for social commentary though? Because again, this is kind of what the episode turned into. It turns into like almost this allegory for date rape. Like what really ultimately was the goal by the end of it? Because it kind of does feel a little bit muddled.
Well, the goal was again that recovered memories are unreliable.
Okay. Yeah.
That. Again, like the McMartin case, all of these teachers basically had their lives ruined because psychologists were inducing these children to remember things like satanic abuse. And the teachers, were totally innocent. And so that was kind of the position that we put this alien Coven in that he turned out to be innocent and had his life ruined by this recovered memory process. And that the recovered memory was totally unreliable. And that we should not have passed judgment based on that.
It kind of reminds me of another episode we talked about in our last episode together, which was the Balana episode, which I'm blanking on a name right now, but it's one of the
Remember, yeah.
Remember, yeah, it very much sounds like that. Like, it sounds like it's kind of really what you wanted to accomplish was essentially in that episode, but in sort of a different roundabout way of doing it. Well,
in that episode, the memories were true.
Exactly, yeah.
And in this case, they were meant not to be. And I guess that's what sort of ended up feeling a little muddled, was that, we never really came down conclusively and said, this is what really happened. All we really came down was, on the side was, this particular assault did not happen. But what did happen, we don't know.
I think that's also one of the weird things about this episode too is, here we are today doing this interview right now in 2022. And, like all this talk of cancel culture is happening these days. And to me, it almost feels like our alien of the week in this episode, like he very much becomes a victim of cancel culture. And it's almost prescient too, like what happened in this episode.
Yeah, again, it has not really aged well. I think that, as you said, today we would not make this episode the same way.
Well, Lisa, let's move on to the last episode, I believe, under your name here, and that would be Omega Directive. And
Right.
again, I feel like this one has a pretty big story attached to it also, because I heard like Brandon Braga said this was a troubled episode during production. So what was so difficult about putting this one together?
I don't remember it being troubled, quite honestly. I mean, again, it came from a pitch, and it was about the concept. It was about, what if there was some substance in the universe that was so incredibly dangerous that we had a standing order to destroy it whenever we saw it? That was the concept. And then we had to find a way to make that relevant to our people, rather than just, we see it, we destroy it, end of story. And again, with Seven being the outsider character who might have a different perspective on this, she was the one that wanted to preserve it. And to her, this omega particle symbolized perfection, which is what the Borg were all about. And so that would put her directly in conflict with Janeway. And that was a conflict that really worked dramatically. I mean, the actresses were very good with it, and just the chemistry was great. So any reason that we could have to put those two at each other's throats was a good reason. So that's sort of the direction that we took this story.
Yeah, this is a really good one. I really enjoyed rewatching this one. And, I like a lot of the subtle religious references that are kind of scattered throughout this episode. And that was like an intention of you, right? That was part of one of the themes of this particular episode?
Yes. I think that Janeway actually has a line in which she refers to it as a spiritual experience.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of reminded me again of another episode we talked about in our last part of this interview here, and talking about religion and spirituality with the episode Sacred Ground.
Mm-hmm.
But this time around, it's from Seven's point of view. And I kind of want to read into a little more of the subtext here and the spirituality of her. So, I mean, two-part question here, but I guess first, looking at the spirituality of 7 of 9, what was it that you were trying to pull out of this character? And well, let's start with that. I'll come back to my second observation. I think that'll probably help out. But yeah, what was the kind of the spiritual goal for 7 here?
Well, the idea was that every person, every being has an urge to look for something greater than themselves. That's sort of the base of all religion is searching for something that is greater than you. And so for 7, that had been the Borg, that had been the collective, the hive mind, and that had been what she was part of, that was greater than herself. But that had been taken away. And so we wanted to give her something else to focus on, that would make her feel like this was something that was greater than herself. This was perfection, which was something that she had been seeking, as a Borg. And so we wanted to kind of dangle that in front of her as a possibility. You could find perfection.
I'm going to throw another movie here into this conversation. I'm going to throw Rocky into this conversation. And the reason being is the opening scene of Rocky, it's notable for that very first shot being a picture of Christ on the cross, there, because Rocky's boxing in a church. And that's our first shot that we pan down to see Rocky in the ring. And like the intention that Stallone had for that was to show that Rocky is kind of not necessarily the savior, but this is his redemption story. This is him going through his journey. Mm-hmm. And so, I come to then one of the final shots in this episode in the Omega Directive, and that's where we see 7 of 9 looking up towards Christ on the crucifix in Da Vinci's home.
Right.
So, there's got to be something else there to it. So, I mean, did you have anything in mind when you had 7 looking at this piece of, looking at this artifact, if you will?
I think that it was progress in her understanding of humanity, in that her experience with this particle and with being so close to perfection helped her understand the human urge, again, toward religion, and towards seeking something larger than ourselves. And so I think that's kind of what that was a reference to, is that it gave her a little bit more insight into the human condition. And that's what we were always looking to do with her, was to help her understand humanity and her own humanity.
Which I think she definitely did much later on when she discovered cheesecake.
Yes.
As we all have.
Yes.
Now, side note too in this episode, B'Elanna is not in this one because in real life, Roxanne Dawson was giving birth.
Yes.
So did that affect the script with you guys at all? Were any sudden changes required for this one?
Well, of course we knew, obviously when she was due. And so for that period of time, the scripts that we knew would shoot then, she was not in very much, so that we could rewrite her out of it if we needed to. Obviously, we weren't going to write like a big B'Elanna episode for the episode that we'll be shooting during her due date. We knew that she was going to need to be light for a few of them.
So you guys were always kind of planning a contingency essentially for when that day happened.
Yes. That's
really interesting. I guess that's one of the things you can do when you're doing TV writing, is like you can kind of afford to have that sort of schedule to know when things are maybe or maybe not going to happen.
Exactly. You can plan to some degree.
So, that's the last episode that you are credited as writer, but I know you were still part of the team. So, I'd like to hear if there were any stories that you were developing that got left on the cutting room floor.
Not that I can think of. Really, pretty much everything that was demand driven. It was like, well, you're up, because I think we had something like 5 staff writers or writers on the time. And so we would basically just take turns. And so when you knew that, your episode was going to be coming up, that's what would kind of inspire me to think about, okay, what could we do for this episode? And so once I had gotten to the point in which I didn't have another episode coming up, I didn't have other ideas just randomly rattling around.
So, we basically have talked about every single episode that you are credited for as writer. And, it's interesting because they all kind of range in different topic and tone and what you wanted to explore. But if there was like one signature Lisa Klink thing that ties them all together, what would you say that was?
I'd like to think it's character, that we learn something about our people, because that's even in the most high concept sci-fi story, ideally you want to learn something about your characters. I mean, I'm thinking about like Scientific Method, again, was very concept driven, but then we get to the point where Janeway has to make this decision to basically play chicken with these aliens, and sort of push her to that extreme where she'd be doing that. I think shows us something new about her character, which was, for me, is kind of the point. I mean, if we're not learning about our people, then why are we telling these stories?
For me, I really love the variety of episodes you got to write, because it's just like, it really shows off so many of your talents and what you can do, which is really kind of the fun thing about working on a show like Star Trek, I'd imagine. You really get a lot of freedom to explore different ways to tell stories.
Yes.
And, if I was going to narrow things down to one thing that I felt was very Lisa Klink, I feel like it's been a theme we just talked about, and that is exploring the spirituality of things. So I'd like to hear, Lisa, for you, what did you learn about yourself in your time on Voyager? I mean, was there kind of a spiritual journey that you went on while you were writing these episodes? Or basically, what was the gift that Voyager gave to you besides a really nice paycheck each week?
It definitely, like you said, gave me a chance to kind of use different muscles. Writing a more action-oriented story or a more, thought-provoking kind of story. It really let me sort of play in a lot of different sandboxes, if you will, and tell lots of different kinds of stories.
And would you say that any of the characters were like an avatar for yourself while you were writing them?
Not really. I mean, there's bits of me in all of them. I mean, some people have called me kind of Vulcan, so maybe I was more in line with Tuvix in that way. And I mean, I certainly enjoyed writing for that character because I found that the concept of that race really interesting. And again, I thought that Tim Russ was so good with it, sort of showing what was behind, the mask in a way. So I always enjoyed that character.
All right, well, Lisa, I want to ask you about a few other episodes that you did not specifically write, but I think you were on the team at the time when these were created. And I want to start things off here with fan favorite, Threshold. So I don't even know where to begin here, but your face kind of says it all. So walk me through Threshold here, and who thought it was a good idea to have salamander sex with Janeway and Tom Paris?
Well, you take away like the last 10 minutes, it's actually not a bad episode.
I'm not going to disagree. Yeah, that's true.
I mean, the concept I thought was good. Again, what happens if you actually break the warp 10 barrier? And Tom Paris is obviously the person to tell that story with. And I think that we just never came up with a really satisfactory answer to the question of what happens when you break warp 10. I mean, the idea was, that you evolve into something, the next stage of humanity. But at some point, that got sort of reversed, that I think it was meant to be sort of ironic that the next stage of human evolution would actually take us back to where we came from, which was, salamanders, basically. And then the whole Janeway part of it was just to add a little jeopardy. Once we had taken Paris to the extreme of being essentially the monster of the movie, then what could he do that would put our people in jeopardy? And that would be, to kidnap Janeway and to take her on this ride. So I understand why each decision was made, but yeah, I think that the twist ending of we're actually evolving backwards didn't quite work.
My biggest thing is just who raised their salamander babies. And also,
yeah, we kind of abandoned them, didn't we?
Yeah, I kind of did. Yeah, and maybe they'd show up in another episode. I was hoping they would. But I guess I almost want you to name names. I'm like, who had the idea to say, yeah, let's have them have babies too? Like, that's just such a weird way to go out.
I don't remember. I mean, it's really hard in a story room to assign, because it's one person will have an idea and somebody else will chime in, and then it's really difficult to point to it was so and so's idea.
All right, so we're not going to point any fingers today, but I do want to ask about another really great one here. And that's Tuvix. And this is a character that is still hotly talked about. Like, I feel like every week I see a thread about him somewhere. So let's get your take on the Tuvix story here. What was the right decision with Tuvix ultimately? What do you think that should have been with him?
Well, to me, Tuvix was actually some of what Star Trek does really well, which is to use sci-fi to pose a really good moral dilemma. Because Janeway really was caught in a no-win situation. It was either essentially kill 2 crew members or kill 1 crew member. And with that, there's no good answer. And I think that, just saving 2 lives as opposed to saving 1 life was ultimately the way that she had to go.
I mean, it's something I still see all the time, people talking about here. I mean, when you're at conventions, do fans ask you about Tuvix?
Every once in a while.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious to know, since I know you do some conventions here and there, like, what's the most common thing a fan's going to ask you about Star Trek?
I guess they want to know, like, what it was like to be on the set and what it was like to work with, the writers and the actors and the directors and basically what it was like to be part of that universe.
And now they have all the answers right here, so they don't have to ask you ever again. So there you go. All right, now let's talk about another really awesome episode here. One of my favorites. I want to say top 10, maybe top 10 2-part, especially 2-parters. But yeah, like it's a really great one. I love watching this one. Killing Game. This one. World War II meets Star Trek. Great concept. I love that you guys had 2 episodes to explore this one here.
Yeah.
So what do you remember, if anything at all, from being part of the writing team of this episode?
I mean, I remember just everybody having fun with the concept of, us being hunted by the Hirogen and them sort of creating scenarios. And again, I can't imagine who actually came up with that idea, and that, would make it a World War II scenario. But I think they wanted to take sort of classic confrontations from history, and the Hirogen would obviously see themselves in the position of the Nazis, who were the hunters, and so I don't know who came up with that idea, but once we came up with it, we really ran with it, and we wanted to make it, obviously, a 2-part episode, just to have more time to play.
Yeah, I'm so happy it was 2-parter, because like you really did get a lot of time to spend with these characters, and they do feel so far removed from like the starship stuff, even though that is a major part of what happens. But I mean, they're really living this fantasy, and it's so fun to see them like interact in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, because there's always the little hints that the actual the character is still in there, that, Tom and B'Elanna were still flirting, even though they were different characters. And, Seven of Nine was still acting very much like Seven of Nine, even though she was this resistance fighter. And I think to me, that was the fun part of sort of seeing the little hints and clues, being laid down in that episode.
I'd love to hear a little bit about Year of Hell also, which, I heard that originally was actually going to be a full-on year. Like, that was kind of the plan, was to have them be chased around for a year. That's true. Wow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because if you think about it, that was the concept for the whole show, was that we were away from Starfleet. We did not have backup. We couldn't go put in at space dock and get repaired. That, we were going to run low on resources, and that, we were on our own. And so I think that premise kind of got played down a bit, in that the ship was always perfect. We had plenty of food, we had plenty of, shuttlecraft, that we obviously repaired everything. And so to kind of take that premise the way that, in my opinion, it should have been from the first place, and play it out over a season, I think would have been fun. Maybe too much, maybe too intense, because by doing it only in a two-parter, we could take it further. We could make it more intense, and take the ship more into disrepair, and be starving and wounded and all that kind of thing. That I think that those elements should have been part of the show all along.
I just love the concept too of the whole episode and how they use time as a weapon. Like, that's just such a unique original idea too.
Yeah.
So what would you say is the episode of Trek that you wrote that you're most proud of, and which is the one that maybe you wish you could have done something else differently with it?
Well, the one that I generally consider the least successful would be Favorite Son. I think I have said that before. It just, the way that it went, I thought was not interesting from a character point of view or a story point of view. That it really was just about having a bunch of really attractive women, lusting after Harry Kim for, evil purposes. And I wasn't crazy about that. Like I said, Garrett Wong has said that he likes that episode for totally different reasons. And so, I totally respect that, if it was promoting, African, Asian American men being attractive, great, run with it. But I'm not crazy about that episode. The one that's probably my favorite, there are a few. I like Blood Fever a lot. And I liked Innocence a lot. I thought that those two were both very successful. And Sacred Ground. I think because those were very character intensive episodes. Sacred Ground, we really got to see Janeway in a different light. And I like that. And the same with Blood Fever, we got to see B'Elanna, doing something very different, and we got to see a different side of Tom Paris, that he wasn't just, always, lusting after women, that he actually, was responsible when it came to it. And with Innocence, getting to see a different side of Tuvok. So I think that the chance to do that, the chance to kind of take a character and really reveal something new, for me is what makes a successful episode.
Yeah, and you're really great at just really nailing down those character studies and really exploring the intimacies and nuances of these cast members. But, with that said, we talked a lot in this episode about folks who didn't get developed quite as much. So, who do you wish that you personally could have spent more time with and written an episode all about them? And what do you think you would have done with that person?
Well, I never really got to write much with Chakotay. So that's probably the character that I feel like I know the least, or I knew the least about. But I think that was universal. I think that none of us really knew the character very well. And the idea of his Native American background, I think we kind of paid lip service to it a few times. We never really dug into what does that mean for a man in the modern era of Voyager, and how do you hold on to the past at the same time as being part of the future, basically. And what made him Maquis, what made him rebel in the first place. I think that there was meat to that character that we never really dug up.
I would agree with that for sure. Yeah, there's a lot. I think that could have been totally explored, and
Mm.
maybe the books did some of that. I don't quite know. If anybody out there knows, go ahead and let me know. But yeah, looking now forward to today and what's going on with today's Star Trek. I mean, do you have any interest in jumping back on the crew to write some modern Star Trek episodes?
Sure, if they ask me, I'd be happy to.
And if you had your preference, which show would you want to be a part of?
Probably Strange New Worlds. That seems very very Trekky, and that it's really about exploring and getting out into the universe.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of fans in particular have flocked to Strange New Worlds as like the best of the new Trek. And I feel like a lot of that is because it is a combination of so many like fan favorite elements in the fandom.
Mhm.
They might hide it, but I think to its core, like to me at least, it feels like it's a lot of the greatest hits of Star Trek.
Yeah.
Not necessarily pandering, but because I'm a big fan of Strange New Worlds. But from your perspective as a writer, why have people fallen in love with Strange New Worlds, but have had such a harder time with something like Discovery?
Well, I think Discovery focused on world building a lot and maybe focused less on the characters. Whereas I think that in Strange New Worlds, I feel like I'm getting to know those people in a more intimate way, more quickly, than I really felt like I was ever getting to know people in Discovery.
And I feel like I want to talk about this with you too, because you're a writer, and I feel like you've had to deal with all sorts of crazy criticisms from fans and higher ups as well. But one of the complaints we always see about Picard and Discovery and any of the quote unquote new Trek shows that get the ire of fans is they always say bad writing. They're always like, oh, they show us such bad writing. So, as a professional writer, when you see a comment like that, what's your first thought?
My first thought is that you try it. that it is really hard. That everybody thinks that they can write because we can all write letters and we can write emails and stuff like that. And so I think that people don't really grasp how difficult it is to write good drama, and that most of the time you're not going to get it right. Especially if, again, when we're doing 26 episodes a season, most of the time we're probably going to miss a little bit, but it's the rare, times where we actually really hit the mark, that stands out. And so I think that the same is true for any show now, that, yeah, you're probably going to have some stinkers and you're going to have some really good ones. And that's always going to be the case.
Yeah, I feel like for me, a lot of the things that bugs that set of the fans, if you will, is I guess the themes that we explore today with modern television. And it's not like Star Trek in the '90s where you could still have these like lofty metaphors for things. Like today, we are much more direct, and because of that, also we can then dive in deeper into more of the intrinsic elements of trauma, of race, and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, how much of that do you think is if you were writing a show today, for example, like how would that affect what you do differently?
I'm not sure. I mean, again, I've never really came at scripts from the what is the metaphor, or what issue are we exploring with this episode. That's not really how my mind works, and that's not really kind of how I generate story ideas.
Would you say you would then like let the characters dictate what the themes would be?
I would think so, yeah. That what is relevant about it to this character? What makes this person grow, or what do we see about them that we didn't know before, related to prejudice or trauma or anything like that.
Do you feel like the modern Star Trek shows are accomplishing that?
I think again they're hit or miss, like every show. I think that they're doing some things that are great, and some things that maybe need a little more work. I mean, I think that Picard has done some really good stuff, in showing us more about that character. I mean, that's sort of the point of the whole show. And I think that they've surrounded him with some other interesting characters. But for me, the less successful episodes are when they actually showed his past trauma. I find it more successful when we see how it's affecting him now. Not so much, let's go back and actually see what happened, but how is he dealing with it? To me, that's more interesting.
So a little bit more like Tapestry, kind of.
Yeah.
So Lisa, what are you working on these days? I saw pre-pandemic you were on a show called Pandora, but what's happening right now in your life and your professional life, I should be specific with?
Professionally, I'm currently writing a scripted podcast called Red Scepter. It's actually a murder mystery, and I'm having a lot of fun writing that. And I'm not exactly sure when it's going to be coming out, but I will make a lot of noise on social media when it does.
And for folks who don't know, by the way, let's plug those social media handles.
I am on Facebook under Lisa Klink 1, I think. And then I'm on Twitter, LK Klink. And those are the two that I use most often. I mean, I'm on Instagram, but I almost never post there.
All right, so everybody, make sure you're following Lisa to see what's new and wait for the Red Scepter to come out. And man, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because we've talked about some mystery episodes here and there. Those are like, to me, some of the hardest things to write. I feel like how do you write a mystery, especially a murder mystery? Like those just boggle my mind completely. I could never do that.
It was challenging. Like I said, I had Post-it notes all over the wall about what clue would lead us to this suspect, and then what would clear that suspect and point to somebody else. And it was a challenge. I got to say, that's one of the hardest things that I've written.
All right, so Lisa, just a few other big picture questions here, if you will. I usually ask this to my guests, and in your case, it might be a little bit of a different kind of answer, but normally I ask folks, what was their best day ever on a set and worst day on a set? You're not necessarily on the set, so maybe best day in the writer's room, worst day in the writer's room, or I guess it's maybe best day, worst day professionally.
Well, I do actually have a best day on the set,
Okay.
and that was the first day of shooting for my Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode, Hippocratic Oath, because it was the first episode that I had produced. And so I got to go to, I was, as I mentioned, I was doing a Writers Guild internship. And so I was actually on the lot, and they let me go down to the set when they started filming my episode. And walking onto that soundstage and seeing what they had built, which was the planet, where Bashir and O'Brien crash, and they had the crashed shuttlecraft, and then they had all these actors that were done up as the Jem'Hadar, and just to see what I had written on the page literally brought to life before my eyes was the most amazing thing.
Now, how about worst day? Was there ever a worst day on a set?
On set, I don't think so, because I just would go down to visit.
Yeah.
I didn't have an official role. And so it's not like I could really screw up my job while I was down there on the set. I do remember some frustrating days writing, just trying to come up with how to make a scene work, trying to figure out dialogue and trying to figure out how to move a character from point A to point B in a single scene. There was certainly some beating my head against the computer.
Well, perfect segue then for my next question. So, when you're confronted with writer's block, how do you smash through it and get to whatever the next part of the writing process is?
Well, the great thing about being in a writer's staff or writing staff is that you have resources. And so you can just go back next door, to your fellow writer and say, I'm struggling with this scene. Let me bounce some stuff off you. And you can start tossing stuff around. When Brian Fuller joined the staff in season 4, he and I were really very often would go into each other's offices and toss stuff around. I think that's how we ended up writing a script together, is that we were really, really good at solving problems together.
All right, well, how about most valuable piece of advice that someone ever told you, whether it was about life or about writing?
Probably when I started on staff at Voyager, I remember Ken Biller told me, don't spend all your money. Because staff writer money is good money. And I remember he told me, don't imagine that you're going to be making this every year. There will be some times in which you're not working at all. So save your money while you're making it, and don't go out and, blow it on, a new house and a new car and all that kind of thing. And that was very true. Because even if you're a successful TV writer, you're going to have seasons in which you're not working. And the money that you make when you are working has to carry you through. So that's the advice I would give to new staff writers, is don't spend all your money.
Very practical, good piece of advice. So last thing here, Lisa, actually it's not last thing, I'll come back to that. So looking across your entire resume here, this can include Star Trek or it could not, it's up to you here, but what is the single most episode of TV that you wrote that you are most proud of?
Wow, that's a tough one.
It's a big resume to think about.
It is. Again, it probably would be one of those Voyager episodes. Maybe Blood Fever, maybe Innocence, maybe Sacred Ground. And a lot of the stuff that I wrote after that was a little more light. Like Martial Law was just fun. and so some of those episodes I think came out like a lot of fun, but I don't know if I would say that they were really insightful.
And last question for today, Lisa. What is the best thing about being a part of the Star Trek universe?
I think it's having all that history around you of knowing that you have the original series and all the movies and the Next Generation, and that you're part of, kind of going off of what we were talking about earlier, part of something bigger. That the Star Trek universe has such power and such influence in pop culture, that to have been part of that and have contributed in some way to something that has affected so many lives and really had such an impact on fiction and science fiction, I think that's really what means the most to me.
Great answer. Now, Lisa, I feel like, we've done like over 2 hours of this chat with each other, but I still feel like we've barely scratched the surface of what you do as a professional. And, really, you've done some amazing work, not just on Star Trek. Obviously, I am biased because you did martial law, but, you've written such a variety of things and so expertly done. And if you haven't ever put out a masterclass anywhere, you really should. So I just want to thank you for really sharing a lot of these inside stories about the behind the scenes things of writing Star Trek and just everything else that you do. So, very grateful to have you on the show this week.
Well, thanks for having me.
That's the end of part 1, but make sure to come back next week for part 2 with Lisa Klink as we continue our Voyager deep dive, as well as spend some time discussing a few other Trek things that she was a part of, plus a bunch of other fun, personal, and professional stories, so don't miss it. That's it for this week's episode of Trek Untold. Until next time, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Trek Untold, all one word. If you'd like to directly support this podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter over on patreon.com/TrekUntold, which gives you access to some great perks that can't be beat. Or pick up some merchandise from our store, or use my Amazon shop link to check out all kinds of different Star Trek merchandise. Links for all these things are in the show notes. Shout out to Triple Fiction Productions for being a key sponsor of Trek Untold. Don't forget to check them out and all of the fine folks whose ads you've seen or heard on this podcast too. If you have any questions, feedback, or comments for the show, or would like to suggest a guest or discuss sponsorship options for any of these episodes in the future, send me a message at trekuntold@gmail.com. I hope to see you here again as we uncover more untold stories from Star Trek and beyond, and get to know even more amazing people who have contributed to this ever-expanding universe. Until next time, I'm Matthew Kaplowitz, and remember, fortune favors the bold.
Trek Untold is sponsored by TrekSphere.com, promoting fan-produced Star Trek content in all forms, is powered by the RageWorks podcasting network, and is affiliated with Nerd News Today.